This video was made possible by patrons like Alexandra S. Thanks, Alex. If you sign up to the Patreon now, you can get an exclusive TLDR lanyard absolutely free. Find out more at the end of this video. In this video, we're going to be taking you through the current situation in Afghanistan and asking whether or not it's really a good idea for the US coalition to be withdrawing from the country right now. So, in case you don't know, the US is withdrawing its troops out of Afghanistan and plans to have fully withdrawn by September 11th. Under the terms of the Doha Agreement, signed by President Trump and the Taliban in February 2020, the US was supposed to have withdrawn all troops by May 1st, but Biden unilaterally extended this deadline to September 11th in April. The number of US troops in Afghanistan has been slowly falling since about 2010, but it was only after the Doha Agreement that the US agreed to permanently withdraw its forces from the area. Anyway, according to the Pentagon, after the US left Bagram Air Base last week, the US withdrawal is now 90% complete. However, an increasing Taliban presence in Afghanistan has triggered concerns among some commentators that a sudden US withdrawal will gift the Taliban control over Afghanistan and reverse the gains of the past 20 years. So let's take a look at the arguments for and against US withdrawal and what some of the consequences might be. So what's the argument for leaving Afghanistan?
We cannot continue the cycle of extending or expanding our military presence in Afghanistan, hoping to create ideal conditions for the withdrawal and expecting a different result.
Biden actually made this argument when he was in the Obama administration too, but Obama and then Defense Secretary Robert Gates took a different view. Essentially, Biden's argument is that there's never going to be a perfect time to withdraw, so now's as good a time as any to leave. Biden clearly has a point. The US has now been in Afghanistan for 20 years, waiting for the perfect time to leave. And over those 20 years, the US has spent nearly $1 trillion and suffered more than 2,300 deaths and left over 20,000 soldiers injured in action. The conflict has also resulted in the death of more than 64,000 Afghan soldiers and some 111,000 civilians, at least according to the latest UN data. The point is that war has a massive economic and human cost, so if there's no perfect time to withdraw, you might as well withdraw as soon as possible. And this has become a fairly mainstream political opinion these days. A lot of people think that America has, somewhat unsurprisingly, failed to convert Afghanistan into a Western democracy, and as such, they should just give up. Nonetheless, there's concern that if the US leaves now, the Taliban will just take over, and any progress that's been made over the last 20 years will immediately be reversed. For those of you who don't know, the Taliban are a militant Islamist group who ruled most of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, after the Soviet withdrawal in the early 90s. They're perhaps best known in the West for providing safe haven for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda after 9/11. Anyway, the Taliban are arguably more powerful right now than at any point since 2001. They've got between 60 and 85,000 full-time fighters, which for context is about the size of the British Army, and now they control somewhere between 30 and 50% of Afghanistan. While the Taliban mostly controls rural areas, they've recently started venturing into urban strongholds. On Wednesday, for example, the Taliban attacked Qala-i-Noor, the capital of the Baghdadis region, with a population of about 50,000 people. According to reports, fighting between the Taliban and Afghan government is still ongoing, but the Taliban seem to be winning. Now, this is technically a violation of the Doha Agreement, which prohibited the Taliban from attacking provincial capitals. But as the Taliban see it, Biden already voided the agreement by unilaterally extending the withdrawal timetable. It's worth noting, however, that even before Biden's announcement, the Taliban had already started surrounding certain provincial capitals, and it's plausible to infer from this that the Taliban never really planned on keeping their word, and were planning on assaulting the provincial capitals anyway. The long and short of it is, the Taliban are now more powerful than the local Afghan forces, and they've made it clear that they're planning to take advantage of the US's withdrawal. So, what's the Taliban's endgame here? Well, most analysts think the Taliban are planning one of two things. Either they're planning to eventually take back Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, or they're planning on using their military power as leverage in peace talks with the Afghan government. Essentially, the Taliban will get to a point where it's obvious that if they needed to, they could easily militarily overthrow the Afghan government, and use that fact as leverage to get what they want out of negotiations. There's two reasons the Taliban might prefer this to a straightforward military takeover. Firstly, it's less likely to invoke Western intervention, and secondly, if the Afghan government sign up to some sort of deal with the Taliban, then that could provide them with some political legitimacy on the international stage. Essentially, while the Taliban are nominally in peace talks with the Afghan government, this hasn't stopped them from fighting for territorial gain, and when the US fully withdraws its military support, it's likely that the Taliban will continue to strengthen their grip on the region. As such, a US intelligence assessment recently concluded that the Afghan government could fall within 6 months of the American military departure. What's perhaps even more worrying than that is that in desperation, the Afghan government forces have invited local anti-Taliban militias to remobilize. While this might give the Afghan forces a better chance of fending off the Taliban in the short term, it will probably lead to a factional war between various militias, which is exactly what happened in the 1990s. Regardless, any Taliban return would be tragically harmful to Afghanistan's democratic aspirations and women's rights in the country, which have both been drastically improved under US occupation. Since 2004, Afghanistan has relatively regularly held presidential and parliamentary elections, with turnouts as high as 45%. Additionally, since US control in 2001, prospects for women have improved massively. Under the Taliban, who ruled Afghanistan from 1996 until 2001, women were forced to wear burqas, banned from going to schools or university, and had to be accompanied by a male member of their household at all times. Today, women in Afghanistan don't suffer any of these wrongs. Women even make up 27% of all Afghan members of parliament, which is actually above the global average of 25%. Therefore, the return of the Taliban would be a tragic step backward for women's rights and well-being in the country, and would effectively mark the end of Afghan democracy. Therefore, opponents of the US's withdrawal argue that it would be a moral crime to abandon Afghanistan to the Taliban now. Even if you do think the US occupation of Afghanistan has been a net harm, it's impossible to deny that women's rights have come a long way, and it would be a tragedy in itself to see this progress reversed. This wouldn't even have to be entirely compassionate either. It's also in the US's interest to make sure that the Taliban doesn't end up controlling Afghanistan, because if history's anything to go by, they'll provide a safe haven for international terrorist organizations. This isn't to say that the US should commit massive resources to fighting the Taliban, rather that some argue a small presence in the area is necessary to hold the Taliban off. Nonetheless, this argument doesn't address Biden's point directly. Biden's point was that there'll never be a perfect time to leave, and, well, it's possible the Taliban aren't going away anytime soon. So even if leaving means terrible things for Afghan women, that's always going to be the case, so we might as well leave ASAP. And there's some truth to this, because the Taliban are a huge organisation, and they've survived 20 years of American occupation, so it's plausible they'll stick around a while longer. Committing US troops until the Taliban are gone and Afghan women can continue to live freely might require a US presence in Afghanistan essentially forever. It is worth noting though that the Taliban are apparently falling out of favour with the Afghan public. A 2009 poll found that half of Afghans had some sympathy for the Taliban, but by 2019 this figure had fallen to 14%. Although for obvious reasons, polling in Afghanistan isn't always that reliable. Regardless, this is clear progress, because the less popular they are, the harder it will be for them to re-establish themselves. This isn't a conclusive argument. Obviously, the Taliban don't rely solely on democratic consent for their rule. It's just to point out that anti-Taliban progress is being made, and could continue if the US were to stay. As a final thing worth saying, a lot of this mirrors exactly what happened in the 1990s with Soviet Russia. After the Soviets left Afghanistan in the 1990s, the Taliban and anti-Taliban ethnic militias entered a sort of civil war. In Taliban-controlled areas, they rolled back any democratic or feminist reforms. If Biden leaves, Afghanistan could relive this history. As ethnic militias enter the fray, civil war is becoming increasingly likely, and the Taliban are going to do what they always do: roll back any democratic and feminist progress made under the foreign occupation. So it's not clear where the country's headed from here, but with the US and others withdrawing, the future looks even less certain and even more worrying. But what do you think? Is now the right time to withdraw, and will there ever be a right time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As I said at the start of this video, we're running a Patreon promotion whereby every patron paying more than $5 a month can get an absolutely free, never for sale lanyard. In order to claim yours, you just have to sign up to the TLDR patron and click the link to the store. Signing up not only snags you a lanyard, but also gets you other perks like early access to videos, exclusive live events, merch discounts, and more. Find out what you can get and sign up by clicking the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.